I'd like you to address your comments on the latest world crisis, Yugoslavia, because in Socialist Worker we've discussed it, and we're against the Air Advance plan, we're against the troops going in, because, well, three reasons, I'll keep very brief. One, like you've made clear, America and Britain have got no record of humanitarian aid, and they're the main troops in this plan. Secondly, I think they've already made things worse, with the Owens-Vance plan has stirred up more ethnic conflict, given the thing was dying down, according to The Economist. And thirdly, I think that the planned intervention is going to push the ordinary person in Yugoslavia back behind their nationalist rulers and make a genuine settlement of the area harder to come by. So, I'd like to hear your view on that one.
You could be right. I think it's very uncertain, and I think trying to predict something like that is pretty low probability judgment. My own low probability judgment, for what it's worth, is that for the moment the least horrible of a set of extremely horrible options, and I don't say the best because it's so bad you can't use that word, but the least horrible for the moment is something like the Vance-Owen plan, and with a peacekeeping force. It'd be nice if you could get only troops from places like Luxembourg and so on, which don't have too much likelihood of pursuing their own national interests, in the hope that somehow that'll damp down the troubles, provide a safe zone for what's left of Bosnian Muslims, maybe create the possibility of a multi-ethnic force developing that could do local patrolling and so on, and then hope that probably most plausibly within the framework of a broader European settlement. One of the, this I think has some relevance to Ireland too, in the context of EC, the European Community, there's a centralization of authority at an executive level, the kind of thing I was talking about, but there's a competing tendency towards regionalization, which I think is pretty healthy actually. There's a lot of ugly things, but in general it's quite healthy. And that opens the possibility that many of these conflicts that have arisen within nation-state systems, which are very brutal systems, part of the reason for the extremely violent history of Europe over the last centuries and the savage injustice of the Europeans that Adam Smith wrote about, which has got worse in a couple hundred years after. Part of the reason for that is that Europe was the leader in imposing the nation-state, which is a very anti-human structure, and it takes extraordinary violence to impose it. And it could begin to break down a bit in the context of the increasing regionalization. And in that framework, you can imagine federal arrangements and regional structures and so on. Maybe a long-term hope would be for the EC to accept not just Slovenia and maybe Croatia, the rich areas, but all the parts of the former Yugoslavia as associates in parallel, and to become involved in a serious way in constructive development programs there, which is not impossible. It was done to a certain extent with Spain and Portugal and Greece before they were brought into the EC. And in that context, it's possible that, especially that can go in parallel with multi-ethnic policing forces and other intercommunal arrangements and a dampening down of the current violence. It's conceivable that something, decent could emerge from it. I don't think this is very high probability, frankly, but I don't know of any better option.
You have a middle management of the new order, which, as far as I would be concerned, be the people who would have molded my mind from I was a child, right? That would be teachers and so on. And you even mentioned people who have written history which actually supports and praises people. So looking at it from my standpoint, that is people who are working at my level, trying to mold me, if they're the first line of attack that I meet as a child growing up, what then should we as a community be doing to try and turn people like that and to develop our own self-confidence, to develop a world that suits ourselves?
Well, I don't think there's much hope in influencing what you might unkindly call the commissar class to change their position on things because they have a stake in it. In fact, the reason why they made it to that position is because they were willing to serve power. There's good reason why intellectuals tend overwhelmingly to be subordinate to power. It's almost a tautology. The ones who refuse to be subordinate to power don't become what we call intellectuals. They become taxi drivers or something like that. The term intellectual has nothing to do with intellectual ability or intellectual achievement or anything else. It has to do with working into certain positions of respectability in which you become a doctrinal manager. And naturally, the doctrinal managers are going to be the ones who support power. Now, it's not 100%, systems are fluid, but there's going to be a tendency in that direction, a strong tendency. And the way to change it is the way to change any system of power. First of all, undermine the power, democratize the systems, create your own alternative institutions, and place those institutions under public control. So, the taxi drivers who have brains become the intellectuals. But that's the same as anything else. That's the same as breaking down the managerial structure of General Motors. It's true that for a lot of us, that's sort of, people like me and probably you, I gather, that's kind of like the first front because that's where we live. But other people live somewhere else. They live in the factory. They have the same problem that we have.
Professor Chomsky, you've wrote a few books about low-intensity war and state oppression. A lot of observers say that's going on in Ireland now. Are you going to write a book about Ireland sometime in the future?
Actually, I've written some things in which I went through the U.S. I don't know the British documents very well. I assume they're the same. The U.S. government documents on what's called low-intensity conflict and looked through the definitions and the analyses and so on, and they're interesting. They happen to be identical with the definitions of terrorism. I mean identical. So terrorism is defined in, say, the U.S. Army Manual as, I forget the exact words, but something like, the use or threat of violence against civilians with the intent of achieving ideological or political or religious ends, short of, nuclear weapons. I mean, short of massive violence. That's terrorism. And that's exactly the definition that's given of low-intensity conflict. You take a look at the manuals on low-intensity conflict, it's the use or threat of violence short of outright aggression to achieve political and social ends directed against civilian populations. And the definitions are exactly right. Low-intensity conflict is just usually international terrorism. Usually international because there's usually a big foreign power, supporting the local, gangsters. But about the only difference between low-intensity conflict and what's called terrorism is scale. Low-intensity conflict is usually massive in scale. It's wholesale terrorism, whereas what's called terrorism is retail terrorism, carried out by small actors. Take, say, the case for which the United States was condemned at the World Court, international terrorism, but kind of low-intensity conflict. In fact, one of the classic examples of low-intensity conflict, the war against Nicaragua. It wasn't outright aggression. The Marines didn't land. They didn't bomb the place with B-52s as they wanted to. They couldn't because of the popular opposition at home. That's one of the changes over the last 30 years. So they couldn't do what John F. Kennedy did in South Vietnam, just blast the place to pieces. They had to go to low-intensity conflict, which meant, and look closely at what it meant, the Contra forces, the U.S. terrorist forces attacking Nicaragua from across the border, were directed by Southcom, the U.S. command in Panama, as the chief general who was then moved over and became NATO commander said, and they were directed to attack what he called soft targets, not, I'm quoting him, not to duke it out with the Sandinistas directly, meaning don't attack military forces because they can shoot back, attack soft targets, okay? Soft targets means things like health clinics, schools, agricultural cooperatives, and so on. Well, after this congressional testimony was given by General Galvin, the head of Southcom, the Southern Command in Panama, the press didn't say anything funny about it. I just reported it. But the human rights groups picked it up. America's Watch protested to the State Department and asked, is this really our policy? And Charles Redmond, who's the State Department spokesman, said, yeah, that's our policy, and furthermore, it's correct. He said agricultural cooperatives the people in agricultural cooperatives have arms to defend themselves, and therefore they are legitimate military targets. So therefore we can go in and blow up an agricultural cooperative. Well, America's Watch pointed out that by the same logic, Palestinian terrorists could go and attack an Israeli kibbutz, let's say, but there was never any answer to that. It was interesting. There was very little comment, but notice that sort of makes the point. Low-intensity conflict is just international terrorism at a large scale. Michael Kinsley is center-right, far left, and he's considered sort of like the conscience of the New Republic, which is the liberal journal and so on. He had a response to this. He said that we shouldn't be too quick to condemn the State Department for authorizing attacks on soft targets, on agricultural cooperatives and so on. That is international terrorism. We shouldn't be too quick to condemn it because he said we have to carry out what he called a cost-benefit analysis. We have to weigh the amount of blood and violence put in with the likelihood that democracy, what we call democracy, will come out at the other end. And if the amount of blood and gore going in and the amount of democracy, as we judge it, at the other end is coming out as a favorable balance, then the cost-benefit analysis says that this is legitimate. Okay, that's an attitude towards international terrorism on the part of the more violent and extremist advocates of it, namely American liberals. That's low-intensity conflict. And that's the same everywhere. When the United States carries out international terrorism, it's not like when, say, Libya does. I mean, Libya is a small country. They may hire, say, Carlos, if they have, some international terrorist and tell him to do something. But the United States doesn't do it that way. The United States is a big player. The United States hires terrorist states. So if you take a look at the Iran-Contra hearings and the Iran-Contra affair and look actually at what happened is that the war against Nicaragua involved a whole array of terrorist states. Taiwan and Israel were there training the killers. Saudi Arabia and Brunei were funding the operation. Britain was supplying specialists and experts to tell you how to attack and destroy soft targets. They know about that thing, got 800 years of experience. I mean, that's a big operation. That's big, large-scale international terrorism. That is low-intensity conflict. They're no different, and you say the same thing here. I mean, you can draw the same conclusions. It's standard.
Do you see the Christian churches on both sides supporting, as they did in the 19th century, the emergence of this new form of international capitalism?
Well, I don't know the situation in Ireland well enough to comment. The one that I know best is actually Latin America. But traditionally, you're absolutely right. I mean, up until the 1950s or the 1960s, the church was just the church of the rich. It was the church of the oppressors. Again, it's not 100%, but overwhelmingly, it was the church of the oppressors. The message was, don't worry about this insignificant world. Things will be okay later on. While the rich men rule, and the church itself was totally corrupt. I mean, it's just unbelievably disgraceful in its whole history, again, with some exceptions here and there. That changed for reasons which aren't at all clear to me around the 50s and the 60s with worker priests, and then crucially, the emergence of liberation theology in Latin America, which was quite important. I'm not a great expert in church history, and I should tell you that as a child, we were the only Jewish family in an Irish and German Catholic neighborhood. And I was an adult before I could overcome my visceral fear of Catholics. So I don't so I don't have no great specialist in the church, but the yeah, right. When liberation theology became significant especially in the 60s and the 70s, it was really a historic change in the church. I mean, and the Medellin and Puebla bishops' conferences were extremely important events. You know, that's when the so-called preferential option for the poor was adopted officially, and it had a tremendous effect. I mean, it affected the other Christian churches as well. At least in the United States, the effects of liberation theology were very widespread across the Protestant churches as well, including the fundamentalist evangelical movements, which are split on this issue. You know, I mean, on the one hand, they'll provide witnesses for peace. On the other hand, they provide, you know, right-wing crazy, all with a lot of commitment. You know, so it's, but and in fact, the war that the United States fought in Central America for the last 10 years, since 1980, was to a very significant extent a war against the church. It's not an act, I mean, I think it's very significant that it began, you know, sort of, it sort of really took off with the assassination of the Archbishop Romero. And the decade came to an end with the murder of the 9 Jesuit intellectuals. That symbolized what was going on. I mean, these were the people who were leading the way with a lot of intelligence and tremendous courage towards organizing the poor to take things into their own hands. They were creating the rotten apple, and that led to an extremely savage reaction with hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered, not just killed, you know, but tortured and murdered and mutilated Pol Pot style, because you got to teach them a lesson. And it's in fact continuing, because you really have to drive that lesson home. And it's striking to see, the Vatican, very unfortunately, though Pope John the 23rd gave a tremendous impetus for this to everybody's surprise, the Vatican then fell into the hands of quite a reactionary group who tried to stem this tide and have been trying in all sorts of ways by selecting the most reactionary cardinal they can find, and I imagine that's going on here too. Right here, is it here? Okay, hi. And that's yeah, I understand. Oh, I thought you meant he was sitting back there. But quite interestingly, it hasn't stopped it. I don't know if they reported here the next bishops' conference, the 1992 Santo Domingo conference. Was that reported here? Yeah. In 1992, December 1992, was the first Latin American bishops' conference after Medellin and Puebla, the big ones. This time, the Vatican wasn't taking any chances. So they ran the agenda. You know, they set the whole thing up so nothing was going to happen. They didn't let the Latin American bishops have much initiative. Nevertheless, the document that came out was so radical, they couldn't even report it in the United States. I mean, it was a big attack. It literally was not reported, as far as I know. It was right in, next door in Santo Domingo. It was a sharp attack on the whole neoliberal structural adjustment programs, which is destroying democracy and creating poverty, and they declared that it's the mission of the church, you know, the parishes and everything else, to struggle against this. And they reiterated the whole business. They described the poverty spreading through the region, which has been enormous. There's been a rapid increase in deep impoverishment since the structural adjustment programs were imposed in the mid-'80s. They described that as not, automatic, not coming from natural law, but the result of human decisions which are destructive and which the church has to combat. And that's very progressive. Well, of course, that leads to the process that you described. There's been a big effort to get around them by extremely well-funded operations, super well-funded operations, in which usually evangelical churches come into places like Guatemala and so on, and try to restore the traditional message being, this world doesn't matter, just worry about the next world. Well, you're familiar with that. And it's succeeded to some extent. I mean, when people are extremely demoralized, and they've just had their communities devastated and so on, they're often susceptible to such a message. And I don't know, the estimates are that maybe a quarter or so of the Guatemalan population has now joined one or another evangelical church. On the other hand, the other Christian communities are also split. So the evangelical Christians in Nicaragua have been at the forefront of social development projects and so on. It's a very double-edged sort of thing, you know. I think it could go any way. I should say, in general, when the North American bishops, say the U.S. bishops, come out with a statement on almost any topic except abortion and so on, it's so radical that the press can't cover it. You know, on the economy, you know, on Latin America, and so on. It's just off the spectrum of discussion in the United States, and that's, you know, pretty conservative bishops right now. It wasn't true 30 years ago.
You've made America out to be an evil empire, and yet to many Irish people, America is the savior. So would you explain that to me, please?
If you mean the American state, it's not going to save anybody except the rich men who run the world, because that's who it serves. If you mean the American population, there's all kind of things going on. The American population has changed tremendously in the last 30 years, much more civilized, you know. The cultural level has increased enormously. The moral level has increased. This has caused total hysteria among intellectuals. That's why you have this big campaign about what they call political correctness, meaning there are just lots of people around who don't agree that you should be racist and sexist, and they have respect for other cultures and all sorts of other crimes. That's definitely happened. In sectors of the American public, it's a very mixed story. I mean, it's, you know, on the other hand, it's one of the most fanatic fundamentalist countries in the world. People talk about Islamic fundamentalism. The United States is more fundamentalist than any Islamic country I know of. It's probably more than Iran. I don't know how many of you saw I don't know if they showed here the first night of the Republican National Convention. They had this thing called a God and Country rally, which you just couldn't find anywhere except in pre-industrial societies. You know, religious fanaticism and jingoist fanaticism and so on. You have that on the one hand. You have a population that's almost out of control on social and cultural issues because it's gone so far to, you know, what you call the left or something on other things. Well, that's, you know, that's the population. If you're looking for the state as a savior, I would look somewhere else. You know, that or any other state.
Would you comment, Professor, on the development of the movement for ethical restriction or control of multinational investment, and how this can be exploited by oppressed peoples in third world countries?
Part of the interaction with the third world on the part of, you know, decent, good-hearted people who go out there to help, it's doubtful how much beneficial effect it's had on the third world, but it's had a very beneficial effect on the home societies, because people have seen things in the world. They get a different perspective. They begin to understand, you know, changes your attitude and so on. That makes a big difference back at home. And things like ethical investment, I think, are like that. I mean, its net effect on investment is very slight. I mean, there really is no such thing as ethical investment. You know, business ethics, I mean, is like a contradiction in terms. You know, you can't have it. It's all robbery. The only question is what form of robbery it is. You can have ethical robbery and unethical robbery, but not much else. On the other hand, just to begin to think about the issues is worthwhile.
In the economic developments that we're talking about here this evening, that it is documented that it is women who are becoming more and more exploited economically.
Oh, of course. Absolutely. The preferred workforce is women who are driven, you know, who are simply driven off the rural areas or, you know, urban slums, and who will work for extremely low wages under impossible conditions and will die after a couple of years, and then you replace them by other women. I mean, that's been going on to an enormous extent. The case of biotechnology, if in a way, is a bit more subtle, but quite important, and it also involves women crucially. Part of the part of this current effort to increase protectionism through GATT, that is to protect intellectual property, a large part of it is directed towards control over seeds and drugs. Now that's a big thing, in comparison to controlling seeds and drugs or animal species and so on. Electronics is like a frill. These are the means of life, right? So it's a huge business. The Western corporations expect to make a mint out of it. I mean, they're talking in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars of profit yearly from taking what they're really doing is taking the lore of the third world, accumulated over thousands of years of experience, plant breeding, selecting herbs, and so on and so forth, taking that lore, robbing it, they don't get anything for it, making slight modifications through biotechnology and cloning new species and new seeds and so on, forcing them back on the third world so that people have to pay royalties when they replant their crops and so on, and then making hundreds of millions of billions of dollars of profit yearly from this. This is a huge business for the future. Well, where do women fit in? The people they're robbing are mostly women. I mean, the agricultural and medical lore of the third world is mostly women's lore. I mean, for millennia, women have been in charge of, in most countries, in selecting plants, determining where they can grow, teaching all this stuff, finding the herbs that do something or other, teaching this stuff to their daughters, It's been something that's been going on forever, in human history. And of course, it's totally unvalued. Its value is considered zero, partly because it's third world, but even more so because it's women in the third world. One of the reasons why, quite standardly, in a third world country, when scientific methods of agriculture are introduced, yield declines. That's continually been noticed. One of the reasons is because all this lore is destroyed. There's some good studies on this. There's a couple of recent studies about, say, Liberia, which has been under U.S. control for a long time, where they came in with scientific methods of agricultural development. Happened in Haiti, too, and quite commonly. Yield declined, everything's subject to disease and so on. Well, when you look closely, as some ethnobotanists and others have done, it's because the women and their daughters and so on who've worked all this stuff out over the centuries, or actually over the millennia, have learned that, on this side of the hill, you can plant this particular kind of grain, when the sun is coming over here, but under a rock on the other side of the hill, you have to plant a different kind of grain, and so on and so forth. And that turns out to be extremely efficient agriculture, also with great diversity, so it's not subject to massive plague, diseases, and destruction. Well, of course, all that stuff is wiped out when the scientific guys come in with the bulldozers and smash everything and plant clone crops from the West, and yields go down. They're subject to disease. You have to have huge amounts of fertilizer and pesticide, ecological destruction, and so on. That's primarily involving women, in fact. There's plenty of things like this. The same is true in the arts. So take a look at the difference between arts and crafts. It's a curious distinction if you look at it. For most of human history, art was done by women, like textiles. Well, that's not called art. That's crafts. It only becomes art when it's done by men and, in fact, done individually. So crafts are some denigrated thing. I mean, there's tons of stuff like this. Feminist scholarship has brought a lot of it out. But as far as I can see, it can all be said quite simply. I don't think it needs the intellectual resources of feminist scholarship. That I'm quite skeptical about. I think a lot of new insights have been brought about by this kind of work. But again, like just about everything else we understand, it seems to me kind of on the surface. Once you see it, once your prejudices are broken and you look, it's all obvious. Breaking the prejudices is no simple matter. That's a big problem.
Over 25 years, what will Western capitalism do with this very virulent strain of rotten apple, which has become almost immune to antibiotics and whatever else has come along? And how do we, I suppose in a capitalist sense, how do we market what we've got here, which is the development, the resistance, the determination of years and years of struggle. But we're not in the third world. We're right slap bang in the middle of Western capitalism.
I mean, I wouldn't even dream of saying how things should happen here. I don't know enough, 50,000 times as much as I do, so you have to give the answers. But the general answers seem to me about the same everywhere. The general answers are to recognize that the authoritarian control of the way life is organized, meaning everything from investment decisions and decisions over, commercial arrangements and so on, up through politics and teaching and so on, all of that structure of authority is fundamentally illegitimate. It should be challenged, to the extent possible it should be dissolved. Control over all of these things, crucially investment decisions, should be in public hands, in communities, in workforces, and so on. And out of that, there is tremendous wealth around. I don't think there's any doubt that there's enough wealth in, enough resources in, say, Northern Ireland to develop quite a healthy and productive and growing society. But it's not going to happen if the decisions are being made in London and Zurich and New York and so on. It can only happen if the decisions are being made here. And then, mistakes will be made, but they can be corrected, and there's possibilities of development. But just how to do that specifically, people here have to work out, not me.
I'd like to take an opportunity on behalf of the organisers, and I'm very grateful for the privilege of being allowed to make this presentation I think you can see it here, for those of you who can't read it that distance. It's a plaque here of Robert Ballas. Robert, as most of you will know, is an artist, nationally acclaimed artist, who is heading up at present the Irish National Congress and the campaign for the right of Articles 2 and 3. It's a new revised history of Ireland and shows two persons at the time of the famine. And the inscription underneath says, in 1847, two peasants debate the benefits of a low-starch diet. I understand neither of them were banned from interview by RTE. I'd like to present this to Noam Chomsky.